Hello, everyone. During the height of the COVID epidemic, as I was busy spraying my mail, groceries, and newspapers with disinfectant, I took over as chair of the Temple Cemetery Committee and was given a box of interesting cemetery documents. I realized that despite our congregation's long and rich history, very little documentation had been saved, and the younger members of our congregation had no memory of the many pillars and leaders of our community that came before them and that I had the pleasure to know when I joined the temple almost 50 years ago. It was then that I endeavored to retrieve and document as much of the history of our congregation and its people back to the formation in the days of the gold rush. For well over a year, I spent my days reading old books, locating old documents, researching old newspaper archives and obituaries, studying the archives at the University of the Pacific, and conducting over 100 interviews that led me to many family photos and memorabilia. Little did I realize that the result would be a 2-volume tome of over 1,100 pages. What follows are some of the highlights of what I found. Most of us are aware that Temple Israel Cemetery on Park and Pilgrim Streets is acknowledged to be the oldest Jewish cemetery in continuous use west of the Rocky Mountains. But the issue of when our congregation was first formed has not always been settled. For many years, it was believed that our congregation was formed in 1855. In fact, based on this belief, a 75th anniversary celebration took place in 1930. An 80th anniversary celebration took place in 1935 at the Hotel Stockton, and a 95th anniversary dinner took place in 1950 at the Hotel Clark. Inconsistent with that, a metal embossment stamp, now in the Schwartz Gallery in the temple, dates the organization of our temple back to 1852. However, attorney Stanley Arndt, in a lecture delivered at the 70th anniversary celebration in 1925, opined that the embossing stamp was not made in 1852, but fabricated later when the temple needed a seal to acquire land for the building of the synagogue. B. Schwartz, unofficial temple historian, delved back even further. B's research found a California Hebrew and English almanac for the years 1851 to 1852, referring to Congregation Raim Ahuvim, our congregation's Hebrew name, with a listing of officers, including President I. Zachariah. Further evidence that our congregation existed as early as 1850 is an article that appeared in the publication Emmanuel from San Francisco in 1912 entitled The Jewish Community of Stockton, that stated that Temple Israel, the present Reformed congregation in Stockton, has a distinction of being one of the oldest 3 congregations in California, and that it was organized in 1850 in the early pioneer days following the first rush for gold, and has continued its existence without interruption. Thus, there is sufficient evidence to conclude that Temple Israel congregation, also known as Raim Ahuvim, began at least as early as 1850, and that its 175th anniversary occurs in 2025. In 1852, before the building of the first synagogue, an article in the Stockton Journal newspaper reported that the Jewish community met in the Corinthian building and observed the High Holy Days in the Oddfellows Lodge. Also in 1852, in an unrelated matter, the San Joaquin Republican newspaper reported that Temple member Abraham Harris was charged with violating the Sabbath blue laws for working in his trade as a tailor on Sunday. However, after proving that he kept Saturday as the Sabbath and attended the Jewish synagogue, his case was dismissed by the court. The first Jews in Stockton were primarily from Germany and Prussia, drawn by the excitement of the gold rush of 1849, and also due to political and financial upheaval in Europe at that time. The more religious Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish immigration from 1880 to 1920 was still many years away. But getting to Stockton in the 1850s was not an easy task. The most treacherous way was to take a covered wagon across the United States, which was subject to attacks from Native Americans, bandits, and issues with the weather, a la the Donner Party. The second route was to take a steamship from New York, connecting with a train across the Isthmus of Panama before the Panama Canal had been built, and then take another steamship to San Francisco. Or one could take a steamship from New York around the Horn of South America and up to San Francisco. Once in San Francisco, there were regular steamers that traveled directly to Stockton, which was the main gateway to the southern mines. Virtually all commerce in Stockton was then located within walking distance of the Stockton Harbor. Gold seekers could then take a stagecoach to the foothill mining towns or get a horse from one of the local stables. This one, the El Dorado Livery Stable, was owned by Morris Magner, a member of Temple Israel. Despite the draw of the gold rush, there is very little evidence that the Jewish immigrants became gold miners. The evidence shows, however, that they were mainly merchants. They sold groceries, liquor, clothing, furnishing, shoes, tobacco, stationery, toys, and hardware. They were also real estate agents, junk dealers, saloon owners, tailors, candy manufacturers, fruit dealers, tanners, attorneys, printers, and jewelers. The following are advertisements from some of the many early Jewish businesses that I found. The Arcade Store of the Arndt family, Abraham Blackman's manufacturing business, the Brummel family's general store, the Cohn family's Paradise Fruit Store, the Friedberg family's general merchandise store, Jacob and Arthur Glick's Jewelers, H. Harris, Pioneer Junk Dealer, M.L. Kaiser's Big Tree Saloon, William Kierske's Bookstore and Saloon, R. Coleman's Palace Clothing Store, Moses and Herman Coleman's Pacific Tannery, Max Morris and Gus Levy's Millinery Store, Morris Magner's El Dorado Livery Stable, Fillmore Marx's Stockton Ice and Fuel and San Joaquin Brick Companies, Morris Manassas's The Sterling Dry Goods Store, D.S. Rosenbaum's Yosemite Clothing House, M&J Stamper's Clothing Store, Joseph Steinhardt and Max Goldsmith's IXL Store, Sam Waldman's Cigar Depot, Morris Weinstein's Clothing Store, and Isaac Zachariah's Auction House. It was not uncommon for some of the more successful merchants to eventually move to San Francisco. One such example is that of Adolf Sutro. He came to California in 1850 and opened a store with his first cousin, Bernard Frankenheimer. They were both single and lived in the back of the store, eating their meals at local restaurants. Adolf eventually moved to San Francisco, where he became wealthy from investments and from the Comstock silver mines. He was granted a charter by the United States Congress to build the Sutro Tunnel, later became mayor of San Francisco, and built a new cliff house and the Sutro baths. He made many charitable contributions to San Francisco. Although there is evidence that the Stockton Jewish community had spiritual leaders as early as the 1850s, most of the initial rabbis were here for only a short period or came to officiate for High Holy Day services. It was not until Rabbi Herman Davidson, who served from 1876 to 1896, that a permanent rabbi stayed for a long period of time. Rabbi Davidson was originally an opera singer in Europe, and during his tenure in Stockton, he brought over many relatives, including the Sinai, Granite, and Davidson families. Over the years, Stockton became a stepping stone for newly minted rabbis who later left and became quite prominent. Rabbi Judah L. Magnus, later known as the Hebrew Divine, was procured to officiate at the High Holy Day services in 1900, where he delivered his sermon at Temple Israel on Hunter Street. The temple wanted him to remain as rabbi, but he decided to head to Berlin for a 3-year course at a theological college. Among his later accomplishments, he laid the groundwork for the organization of the American Jewish Committee and helped found the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, becoming its first president and chancellor. Among his many accolades, the Judah L. Magnus Museum in Berkeley, California, the first Jewish museum of the West, was named in his honor. Rabbi Edgar F. Magnin, the grandson and nephew of department store giants Isaac Magnin and Joseph Magnin, first served as rabbi in Stockton from 1914 to 1950, directly from rabbinical school. In 1915, he wrote that Temple Israel had a membership of 64, with a religious school enrollment of 85 children. When the Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles wrote to the Temple Board in Stockton requesting that Magnin be released from his contract in Stockton to come to Los Angeles, he wrote that he believed that someday Los Angeles will be a larger city than Stockton. Rabbi Magnin went on to serve the Wilshire Boulevard and Temple in Los Angeles for 69 years. He was described as the best-known rabbi in America. His friends included Jack Benny, Albert Einstein, Popes Pius XII, and Paul II. And he delivered Ronald Reagan's gubernatorial inauguration and President Nixon's inauguration prayer. Throughout his prolific career, he maintained his contact with the Stockton Jewish community. Aaron Leland Shapiro was engaged as a rabbi in Stockton from 1904 to 1905 while still in rabbinical school, and again later from 1908 to 1909. In 1913, he married Janet Arndt Shapiro, the daughter of one of Stockton's most prominent Jewish families, who he had met earlier when she was in his Bible study class in Stockton. While in rabbinical school, he concluded that he could not change the world as a rabbi, and before graduation, left to enroll at Hastings College of the Law in San Francisco. He was admitted to the California bar in 1911 and went on to a prominent career in the law as a labor and agricultural activist. According to the New York Times, Shapiro was the leader of one of the greatest agricultural movements in modern times. However, he is best known for his 1925 libel lawsuit against anti-Semite Henry Ford for allegations in Ford's book, The International Jew, the World's Most Foremost Problem, and in his newspaper series, The International Jew. The case concluded in 1927 when Ford secretly commissioned Lewis Marshall, a Jewish activist and constitutional lawyer, to write a formal apology that ended the litigation and set the stage for the conclusion of the Dearborn Independence anti-Jewish campaign. An interesting development occurred at Temple Israel after a Mrs. Ray Littman Frank, a woman who was not technically a rabbi, lectured at Temple Israel on Rosh Hashanah in 1895 and again in 1897, as arranged by then Temple President M.S. Jaffe. Based upon her lectures at West Coast synagogues, lodges, Jewish societies, and women's groups, she had become known as the girl rabbi of the Golden West. A big controversy occurred in 1897 after Frank succeeded in healing a breach among members in Stockton. Dr. M.S. Jaffe attempted to have Ms. Frank installed as rabbi, while some members concluded that it was against Mosaic law. The matter was finally dropped when Frank informed the interested parties that she had no intention of occupying a pulpit on a permanent basis. Here are some photos of some earlier, lesser-known rabbis. Rudolf Faber, here from 1898 to 1900. Elias Margulies, 1901 to 1903. And Max Raisin, 1903 to 1904. Of the more than 37 known rabbis who have served Temple Israel in our more than 170-year history, the one who has served our community the longest is our own beloved Rabbi Gwozdov, who has blessed us with his spiritual leadership since 1993. Temple Israel's synagogues have thus far been located at 4 different locations. In 1855, the congregation decided that instead of continuing to rent, a subscription was started to build its first temple. Once more, Captain Weber, who had previously donated land for the Jewish cemetery, stepped in and donated a 100-foot square lot on the south side of the north bank of the channel on Minor Avenue between Hunter and El Dorado Streets. A deed was prepared granting the parcel to Temple President Simon A. Rosenthal and the trustees of the temple. The officers then signed a contract for a structure of wood on a solid brick foundation of 50 by 15 feet for the sum of $2,650. Since there were no sawmills in existence in this part of California at that time, the lumber for the building was brought around the Horn of South America and arrived at the Stockton waterfront. In order to save hauling charges, Michael S. Arndt, Samuel Lewis, who later donated Lewis Park, and Abraham Levy hitched their 3 horses to one wagon and brought the lumber to the building site. The building was formally dedicated on September 7, 1855, before an audience of both Jews and non-Jews, with services conducted by Rabbi Julius Ekman of San Francisco. By 1857, there were 30 temple members and their families, and each member paid dues of $1 per month. This first temple lasted only 8 years at that location, because after it was completed, it was found that the rear of the lot was often under a great deal of water, and during the bad flood of 1861-1862, the floor of the synagogue was under 2 feet of water. As a result, the lot was sold in 1862, and the building was moved to a new location on a lot on the east side of Hunter Street, 3 feet above the ground, across the street from the residence of Temple member Moritz Kiersky. The synagogue was later enlarged and renovated and utilized until 1905. It was then sold to a school custodian who converted it into a 4-unit apartment and moved it to 821 North American Street, where it is still standing today. It is also recognized as the oldest non-residential building in Stockton, and the oldest Jewish synagogue in California. The second Temple Israel synagogue was constructed on Hunter Street between Lindsay and Fremont Streets, where the present-day post office stands, and was completed in 1905. Fundraising came from the Hebrew Ladies Benevolent Society, the Busy Bee Fair, the Temple's General Fund, the Hebrew Ladies Auxiliary, and others. The building fronted 45 feet on Hunter Street and had a depth of 104 feet. The building cost $11,824 and was dedicated on September 12, 1905. A list of those who donated to build the temple has been found. Temple members donated stained glass windows that have survived, as did a tablet of the 10 Commandments. Rabbi Harvey Franklin, who was installed in 1916, later recalled the redwood interior of the temple and that the sanctuary was filled with moths. He also remembered that he was expected to take care of the temple furnace that was not in good working order. The synagogue building was utilized until 1928, when it was renovated and moved to a new location on one of two lots that were purchased on Madison and Willow Streets. The Hunter Street lot was then sold to the United States as the site for a new post office. The new renovated synagogue was utilized from 1928 through 1962. Many of the artifacts from the interior of that synagogue are currently on display in the Schwartz Gallery at Temple Israel. This photo of Cantor Ben Pearl, standing to the left, and Rabbi Sajewicz, right, was taken during High Holy Day services at the Madison Street Synagogue in the early 1950s. The tablet, lectern, and brass railings visible are currently displayed in the lobby of our temple. The second adjacent lot was for a Jewish community center that was to be built. Groundbreaking for the center occurred on May 14, 1928, and it was dedicated on December 16, 1928. Rabbi Wessel was an early proponent, and at a dinner on May 5, 1925, Rabbi Edgar Magnin appeared and strongly supported the project. When completed, the center was utilized by Jews from Temple Israel and the other two congregations in Stockton, Ahavas Achim and Adas Yeshurun. The auditorium upstairs had a stage utilized for activities such as the temple hijinks productions and Purim spiels. It was also used for meetings as well as for Passover dinners. By 1956, there already was talk of a new synagogue. The synagogue was crowded and had no air conditioning. Fay Goldman wrote a stinging letter to the board highlighting the need for a new temple. In 1959, Al Davidson became the chair of a building fund committee that raised $100,000 from 3 meetings towards a goal of $250,000. According to Bruce Berg, his father and grandfather, Harold and Morris Berg, found land for the new temple on the corner of March Lane and El Dorado and donated $50,000 towards the purchase. In 1959, the temple purchased 3 acres for the new site from the grandson of Captain Weber. The initial planned phase consisted of 12 classrooms, a multi-purpose room, restrooms, a small kitchen and administrative offices, at an estimated cost of $200,000. Groundbreaking occurred on October 25, 1959. These pictures depict the placement and installation of the stone tablets erected and that still stand in front of Temple Israel. The first phase was completed in 1962. The second phase included a sanctuary seating 400 and a meeting hall. A second capital campaign was organized in 1970 for this purpose, and groundbreaking occurred on April 18, 1971, and the sanctuary was completed and dedicated on February 4th through 6th, 1972. By 1996, the original buildings were 34 years old, and the sanctuary was 24 years old. Al Davidson and I approached the temple board to obtain authorization to commence a new capital campaign to renovate the sanctuary, enlarge the temple offices, create a vestibule lobby with an historical lobby, renovate the bathrooms, and update Rosenberg Hall. We became the chairs of the capital campaign that raised $1.4 million, which included money that was left by B. Schwartz to build the historical gallery. The temple renovations, additions, and the Schwartz Gallery were completed and dedicated on October 20, 2001, in conjunction with the celebration of the 150th Temple Israel Gala Dance and Dinner and the 27th Annual Food Fair. In 2008, in the throes of a serious economic meltdown, Stockton became known as ground zero of the mortgage foreclosure crisis, with banks filing foreclosures on 1 in 25 residences. At the same time, however, deferred maintenance of the temple classroom wing brought about roof leaks and molds, which made the classrooms unsafe for students. Furthermore, worn-out heating, lighting, windows, and electrical systems, all approaching 50 years of age, were in dire need of replacing. Al Davidson and I, believing that the congregation would rally to support a fundraising event, agreed to lead another capital campaign to provide for these improvements. Both Nate and Annie as forums and Laurie and Monty Merrill stepped up and generously provided the lead gifts. The amount of $1.5 million was ultimately raised to enable completion of the needed renovation. Then President Laurie Merrill led the program for the dedication of the new classroom renovations on September 9, 2012. According to Jewish law, it has always been considered more of a priority to have a hallowed ground to bury the dead than to build a synagogue. So when Solomon Friedlander died in Stockton in 1851 at age 35, representatives of the Jewish community formed a committee to call upon Stockton's founder, Captain Charles Weber, to ask for ground to build a cemetery. In response, Captain Weber took a map from the top of his desk, studied it for a few minutes, then pointed to a particular spot. Displaying his usual generosity, he said, "Use this place. I'll deed the whole block." Solomon Friedlander therefore became the first person to be buried there. In 1854, Captain Weber later formally deeded, in consideration for $1, an entire city block, 300 feet square, then in North Stockton, bounded by Union, Acacia, Pilgrim, and Poplar Streets, to Isaac, Zachariah, Hiram Mitchell, M. Jacobs, and M. Goldman, trustees of the Israelitic Society of Brotherly Love, the English translation of Ra'im Ahuvim. From 1851 to 1891, the cemetery was taken care of by the Women's Burying Ground Association of the Hebrew Ladies Beneficent Society. In 1859, the society held a ball in City Hall to raise money to erect a small iron fence to properly enclose the grounds. Cypress and osage trees were planted around the perimeter, and families set aside plots for their own use. As a result of Temple Israel joining the Reform movement at the end of the 19th century, Orthodox congregations Ahavas Achim and Adas Yeshurun were formed by the more religious Eastern European Jews who began arriving at that time. Their new cemeteries, both in French Camp, began being utilized in 1900 and 1904, respectively. Cantor Davidson arranged to purchase land for Ahavas Achim Cemetery by contacting his friend, Father William B. O'Connor, the namesake for O'Connor Woods Retirement Community. The Catholic Church then provided a deed signed by Father O'Connor and Julia Weber, granddaughter of Captain Charles Weber. Congregation Adas Yeshurun drew up its constitution in 1910 and had its charter issued by the state of California in 1911. In the early 1900s, as the new Eastern European immigrants flocked to the new Orthodox synagogues, Temple Israel Cemetery was only given minimal care and started to deteriorate. The shrubs were neglected, the orange trees grew into thick hedges, and the windmill needed repair. In an isolated corner, tramps often spent the night waiting for a passing freight train. Vandals damaged the monuments and desecrated the graves, using wooden markers as firewood to keep warm. In 1907, Leo Glick, an engineer and native of Stockton, whose family had been pioneering members of Temple Israel, and whose father, Jacob Glick, has served the temple as president, made a complete record of the graves and plots. His notebook was later lost, but found many years later, and proved to be of great value in a subsequent rehabilitation of the cemetery. It confirmed that 12 graves are over 150 years old. In October 1915, Cemetery Committee Chair Stanley Arndt noted that since the temple had refused to pay the sum of $4,500 to improve the streets around the cemetery, the city of Stockton wanted to buy the cemetery grounds and convert it to a park with the idea of moving the interred bodies to a new location, perhaps 6 or 8 miles outside of the city. It was estimated by the city that the cost of removing the 75 bodies was $1,645, and that the monuments could be reset for about a total of $500. Arndt estimated that the cost of the land was $10,000 to $12,000. This issue was discussed at the annual congregational meeting of November 1915. Despite Arndt's disapproval, the motion to sell the cemetery and find a new one was carried. Minutes from the congregational meeting the next year, in November 1916, reflect, however, that due to a lack of funds, the matter had been dropped by the city. Who knows where the cemetery might be now if the city's original plans had come to fruition. In February 1929, Temple President Isaac F. Stein reported ongoing negotiations with the Orthodox congregation regarding taking over their cemetery. Although a contract had been drawn up, this did not come to fruition until 91 years later, in 2020, when Adas Yeshurun Cemetery was finally deeded to Temple Israel. In December 1937, Ida Lichtenfeld, a widow, passed away. She had been a deputy sheriff for the county of San Joaquin. She was the first to have her cremated remains buried in the cemetery. Her daughter, B. Schwartz, was appointed a member of the Cemetery Rehabilitation Committee. In 1949, B. became president of Temple Israel Sisterhood, and Rabbi Gittin appealed to her to further improve the condition of the cemetery. One anonymous member of the congregation offered a sizable sum for the restoration work, provided matching funds were obtained from others, which ultimately did not materialize. In 1956, the potential donor, now identified as Dr. William Friedberger, agreed to bear the entire expense himself, and plans were made to complete the restoration, which included repairing or replacing old headstones, removing overgrown shrubbery, replacement of the old tank house with a new shed, and the fabrication of beautiful wrought iron gates with red brick pillars. Upon completion of the restoration, B prepared documents for the cemetery to receive a state historical landmark designation. A rededication ceremony at Temple Israel Cemetery took place on December 10, 1961. In her detailed article entitled Oldest Jewish Cemetery in the West, Stockton, California, published in the Western States Historical Quarterly in October 1968, B concluded the following: as one stands at the gate and contemplates the scene, one sees this sacred ground set apart for all time. The cypress trees and other trees seem to be standing with outstretched arms, protecting those who have been laid in the green sod at their feet. The fine old monuments are in a setting that complements their aged, mellow dignity. All help to complete the story that began 118 years ago. Amidst all of this, one feels the unwritten epitaph, forget that I died, remember that I lived.